Very few people have done what we've done. In fact, no other agency across Australia has done what we've done, and no one within the Lifeblood family has done what we've done.
Well, a big welcome to Tony, Melissa and Matt. For anyone who's not familiar with Donate Life Victoria, could you start with a little background on what it is the organisation does?
Sure. Donate Life Victoria is part of the national network of organisations that work with families at end of life to determine if there's a desire for their loved ones to become organ donors. So we only work with deceased organ donation, and every state and territory in Australia has a Donate Life agency. And obviously we work very closely together across borders to ensure that life-saving organs are available to as many recipients as possible year on year.
Fantastic. So Tony, Donate Life Victoria is managing a clinical process that's literally a race against time, so pretty important. For someone who doesn't work in a hospital, can you describe a little about what the coordinators are navigating when they get a referral?
Every end-of-life situation that fits the criteria, and it's quite complicated what the criteria is referred to Donate Life. Mm-hmm. And so we have a 24/7 on-call service that takes referrals from hospitals. So we only get referred from hospitals. Once the referral comes in, they do an analysis to determine if that particular person, based on their circumstances, age, medical history, could be considered to be an organ donor. And then, depending on the time of day and the availability, our nurses will go into that hospital and will meet with the families. There's a number of checks that are done first, but they meet with the family and they have the conversation to determine if the family will support organ donation for their loved one. So as you can imagine, that's a very difficult time for families, probably the worst time of their lives. And our nurses are very highly skilled in having those really difficult conversations at the hardest time of people's lives. And if there is consent, then it's a very complex case. It takes about 48 hours from the time of the conversation to theatre if the case proceeds, with many moving parts. So it's a very complicated process.
And can you talk a little about some of the friction that exists when that process is occurring?
Well, there are a number. One is, and Matt will talk about logistics in a minute, but there are many aspects of a case, clinical challenges around suitability and so on, and the nurses need to have an understanding. Obviously they are very highly skilled clinicians, but they need to have an understanding of all aspects of suitability through the donation case, and that's complicated, and it's very time consuming, chasing information. And this is one of the things we're seeking to address, reduce the complication, reduce the time spent, and make the process more seamless for the staff.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tony. Matt, you're managing a pretty complex logistical challenge and process across the state of Victoria at Donate Life. How do you ensure a donation specialist is available instantly to ensure that every hospital referral or registered track, regardless of the hour?
Yeah, so we have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week roster. We have nurses embedded in most hospitals around Victoria. So when a referral comes in, and the circumstances in which a person dies and can become a donor is very rare. It's about 2% of people who die in a hospital die in a manner where donation can be possible. So we really don't want to miss anyone. So if a referral comes through to us, we'll either activate someone who's at the hospital or we'll send a nurse over there to manage that case. And as Tony said, they'll do a bit of high-level assessment for suitability, and then we speak to the family. And there's a lot of complexity in that nursing role. There's a lot of balls in the air. They're looking for suitability. They're offering organs all around Australia. There's 1,800 to 2,000 people on wait lists at the moment. We had to get the right organ to the right person. They've got to organise retrieval teams, theatres, courier services, planes, police escorts, all those sorts of things. So there's a lot of complexity in there. What we are trying to build here is a system and an agent that can make their lives a little bit easier, allow them to spend a little bit more time with the families through that end-of-life journey.
And you're working with a network of 15 independent hospitals across the state. How do you ensure that this complex clinical information is captured when it needs to be?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's difficult because in Victoria especially, we don't have one single electronic medical record. Each hospital, each health service has their own. We have a huge amount of information that our nurses need to access to manage cases. There's clinical practice guidelines, there's SOPs, there's there's a lot of health-specific, organ-specific documentation around suitability, how to offer on. They deal with electronic medical records, organ match, a whole bunch of computer programs. And all that information gathering and searching is very manual at the moment. They're having to go back to our central hub at SharePoint to manually search for information. It's labour intensive and it's time consuming. So, as I said, our aim is to make that a little bit easier for them.
And team, with Donate Life Week driving so much public interest, how do you manage the spike in volunteer inquiries and activities that you see during that period?
Currently we're looking at a volunteer program within Salesforce where we gather all this information from our volunteers, but also we capture all of our media stories in Salesforce currently. So that will allow us to keep a 360 view of our volunteers. And this will allow us to be able to communicate with them a lot better. Currently we've got over 200 media stories and media interviews that we can always review at a later date and gather that information when we need it. And we are looking at a volunteer program within Salesforce which will allow us to go out to the community. We'll use campaigns, we'll be able to roster them accordingly. And that's really exciting for us because recently, our volunteer program has had a bit of a shake-up. So we want to bring our volunteers back together and really provide them with the activities that they want to be doing because a lot of our supporters and volunteers are really passionate about the cause and they really want to be out there in the community explaining and telling their story. So,
and it's really important because community awareness is really important. At the time when their loved ones are dying, if the family is aware of their intent to want to donate, then the conversation is a lot easier.
Yeah, and probably one thing to be clear about is that donation only continues if families consent. So even if the person themselves has registered as an organ donor, the family has the final say.
Melissa, one of the things you were saying earlier was the media database, the tracking of those stories, and I imagine being able to tell those stories is really impactful in driving further engagement. So you're building a secure clinical tool currently with Agentforce, which is really exciting. How will shaving just 15 minutes off each of these search interactions have a positive impact on the work that you do?
Yeah. Look, it may be 15 minutes in interaction, but there might be numerous interactions per case. If you shave some time off those sort of remedial tasks, then you can put more time to being with the family through that journey. There's lots of things running in parallel. They're organising scans and tests. They're organising courier services, theatres, all that sort of stuff. So, shaving, it might save us an hour a case, might save us 2 hours a case. There's small windows in donation. We've got a small window for theatre. If we miss theatre, we may have to wait another 24 hours for theatre. If we can't get a retrieval team there, we may have to wait. If the family has to wait an extra day to say goodbye to their loved one, they may just say, no, we don't want to go through this. And what's more, it'll probably reduce a bit of fatigue, especially screen fatigue for our nursing staff. The burden, we run a medical consultancy on call, like a manager on call to support our nurses 24/7. So when our nurses are really rushed for information, they'll ring up our manager. We think that a lot of those calls are made, the information is already readily available in the documentation. They just don't have time for the search or they don't know to search. So we think a lot of that volume of on-call calls will reduce, reducing the burden on our on-call roster. Our calls that we get at 2 or 3 in the morning, it's costly from an agency point of view, but it's also fatiguing for our staff. So there will be some significant benefits, we think, to having really quick access to accurate and precise information.
You've adopted a go fast wisely approach with Salesforce. Can you unpack that a little and tell us a little bit more about?
We needed to go fast, but we needed to make sure that we were doing it right. So, we spoke to our nurses and doctors, we made sure that they were on board, we got them involved in our working group, we got them to explain to us what they wanted within this clinical assistant that we were going to build. We also needed to make sure that it was right. We could go fast, but we needed to make sure it was right. So we made sure that we looked at our governance and we made sure that we will build things with guardrails because we know the agent isn't going to be able to provide the answers. It's still going to be in the hands of our nurses and doctors to make those clinical decisions. So we needed to make sure it was right for them.
Very few people have done what we've done. In fact, no other agency across Australia has done what we've done, and no one within the Lifeblood family has done what we've done. So we needed to make sure that what we were considering was clinically safe, and appropriate for a healthcare setting. So we spent a fair amount of time consulting with key players to ensure that this was a wise thing to do. And in fact, we were applauded for the process that we undertook to ensure that that was the case. And then, as Mel said, we consulted with our co-design council, which is made up of various stakeholders within our own organisation. And overwhelmingly from day one, we've had, I'd say, unanimous support from everyone involved. We've done it really well and very carefully. It's taken a full 12 months. That sounds slow, but it's actually quite a fast process, really.
Now, you've spoken a little bit about trust there, Tony, and clinical staff are working in a really high-stakes environment where trust is paramount. Can you talk a little about how you've been involving your coordinators through the design and build process to really ensure that they trust the tool?
Absolutely. So we, first of all, as Mel indicated, we floated the idea fairly early on with our senior nurses to ask them, what do you think? Has this got legs? Could it be of benefit? And relatively quickly, they all felt, doctors and nurses, all felt that this, yes, was worth exploring. We then put it through the lens of our co-design council, as I mentioned, and had a couple of meetings threshing out what it would mean and how it would work. And again, there was overwhelming support. And getting closer to the time when we were actually looking to start the build, we then went out to the nurses and said, we now need to actually have examples of the sorts of questions. So the nurses themselves have provided I think 30 or 40 questions to us to actually then use as the first part of the build. And that's where we are at the moment, and that was very effective. Going forward, we'll obviously use our AI information group or source group to then rigorously test, because again, as Matt said, we need to make sure that the information that's been provided, it's a bit like when you go to realestate.com and it says, high level of confidence, medium level of confidence, low level of confidence. We need the nurses to know with high level of confidence that the answer that's been given is accurate and where the answer has come from. So that's where the guardrails are being built, because we can't afford for poor decisions to be made. Whilst the decision ultimately is with the clinician themselves, we don't want the agent, our VCA, we're calling it VCA, Virtual Clinical Assistant, we don't want our VCA to confuse the process, but that will absolutely lose confidence if we do that. So as we get towards the final phases of the implementation, it's really important for us to then have the nurses actively involved in testing, because accuracy is critically important.
Yeah, it's a really important point, because as I said, there's reticence in healthcare to adopt AI because of the consequences if the information is wrong can be quite significant. And again, if cases are stood down because the information is incorrect, potentially lives can be lost. But importantly, our staff will lose faith in the process, and they won't use it anymore.
So trust is obviously so critical here. When we think about the reclaimed time for a nurse or a coordinator who might be on a 12-hour shift, what does that actually mean in terms of the time that you're able to give back?
It's a very, very demanding job. They're dealing with death and dying every day. And there is a lot of fatigue in the role, and we don't want them working those 12-hour shifts. We want information to be passed along to the person picking up the shift next, who's working the case, the handover. We hope to use our agent for that as well. Retention of our staff is super important. Making their job easier is our responsibility. It takes us 8 to 12 months to train up a new specialist nurse for donation. So if we lose staff, the downstream effects are significant on the workforce. It puts more and more pressure on those existing staff. As Tony said, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. They want support here. We've heard that they need support, and we're hoping Agentforce will be the answer.
Well, I know we've got a busy day ahead, but any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
We're trying to make their job simpler. We're trying to allow them to spend more time with families. That's where the benefit will be. It will be in how happy our staff, how engaged our staff are with their job. That's what we're looking for, and whatever we can do to make their jobs easier, and Agentforce hopefully will be one of those steps.
My final comment would be that organ donation saves lives, and we can all play a part in saving lives by registering as an Australian organ donor at donatelife.gov.au and talk to your family. Because every conversation you have with your family, every conversation you have with your loved ones, with people that you know, means that there's a greater chance of people saying yes at end of life, and more people being organ donors and therefore saving lives.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Tony, Melissa, and Matt, for being incredible trailblazers and sharing your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.